Hello, friends. Are you watching this alone or with someone? Tell me in the comments.
Thanksgiving in our house always looked like something out of a Target commercial. Linen tablecloth, candied yams, no one really liked. That same damn turkey Nancy insisted on roasting, even though it always came out dry. And every year, without fail, my older sister Chloe made an entrance like she was strutting down a red carpet and not our cracked concrete driveway. She showed up late, dragging her screaming kids behind her husband Tom carrying a bottle of overpriced red wine, and that smug smile he wore like cologne. And every year I told myself I'd just get through it, eat my mashed potatoes in silence, maybe help Dad to the couch when he got tired, and then hide in my room until the whole charade blew over. But this year was different. This year, I was ready. I'd spent the morning setting the table alone. Mom, Nancy if you asked Chloe, who liked to pretend we grew up in Connecticut and not rural Pennsylvania, was fluttering between the kitchen and the living room, pretending not to hear Dad asking for help with his meds. I handled it like I always did, quietly, efficiently, and without thanks. The tension in my jaw had become permanent by the time Chloe finally arrived. All perfume and passive aggression, talking too loudly about her insane car ride in, and how nobody appreciates how hard it is traveling with kids. She hugged Mom and air-kissed Dad, barely looking in my direction, except to give me the once-over. "Oh," she said with a forced laugh, "still wearing those leggings. Must be comfy working from home, huh?" I smiled, didn't rise to it. She never really listened when I tried to explain what I do. Remote systems analyst for a logistics firm, might as well be Martian to her. We sat down to dinner, and as soon as everyone had a plate, the performance began. Chloe had this way of making everything about her sound noble. Her job as a part-time event planner suddenly became managing corporate clients, and Tom's dull job in insurance became executive risk strategist, which, I'm convinced, is just a fancy way of saying he files claims all day. The kids were restless, Mom was beaming, Dad was halfway asleep, and me, I was waiting. Halfway through her second glass of wine, Chloe turned to me with that syrupy voice she uses when she's about to say something cruel under the guise of sisterly concern. "So, Em," she said, "still living here, huh? You know, at some point you gotta spread your wings." She laughed. No one else did. Then she added, louder this time, "You still live with our parents? That's so pathetic." Now let me explain something. I'd heard that sentence in some form or another for years, at birthdays, Christmas, even random phone calls. Chloe never missed a chance to remind me that I had somehow failed at adulthood, that I was the weird one, the sad one, the one who never left. And normally, I'd just nod, maybe make a joke, then disappear quietly. But this year, I didn't laugh. I didn't even blink. Instead, I stood up slowly, took my napkin off my lap, and walked into the kitchen. Everyone assumed I was going to cry or grab a drink or maybe just storm off. And that's exactly what I wanted them to think. But I didn't cry. I didn't pour a drink. I opened the cabinet under the sink, reached behind the stack of cleaning supplies, and pulled out a manila folder I'd kept there for months, waiting for this moment. I held it in both hands for a second, the weight of it oddly comforting, and walked back into the dining room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a speech. I simply placed the folder on the table, flipped it open, and let the top page, clean, crisp, notarized, speak for itself. "Funny," I said, finally making eye contact with Chloe, "because this house is in my name." Silence. For the first time in probably a decade, Chloe was speechless. Her jaw hung slightly open. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mom's face went pale. Dad looked up, confused, then slowly nodded, like something in the back of his mind had just clicked into place. The kids stopped fidgeting. Even the dog, curled up under the table, lifted its head. I let the silence stretch, let it sit heavy in the air. Then I gently pushed the deed toward the center of the table. "It's been in my name for almost 2 years now," I added, still calm. "I thought it was better to keep things quiet, for the family." The sound that came out of Chloe wasn't quite a laugh. It was more like a choke, equal parts shock, rage, and disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about?" she said finally. "You're lying." I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The notarized copy said it all. Full ownership transferred. Witnessed. Signed. Legally binding. She reached for the papers like she might tear them up, but stopped herself. She looked around, waiting for someone to come to her defense, to back her up. But no one said a word. And just like that, I watched her perfect little world crack, just slightly. The house she mocked me for living in, I owned it. And I hadn't even begun to explain why. There are moments in life that feel like the beginning of a thunderstorm. Silent at first, just a subtle change in pressure, a shift in the air, something you can't quite name, but your body feels it before your brain can explain it. That Thanksgiving dinner, with Chloe sitting across from me like a porcelain doll beginning to crack, was exactly that kind of moment. But the storm hadn't begun that night. It had started years earlier, quietly, in a hospital room filled with the smell of antiseptic and the low rhythmic beep of a heart monitor, the last place you'd expect to change everything. It started with Uncle Ray. Uncle Ray wasn't a man who needed the spotlight. He didn't raise his voice, didn't meddle, didn't bother with the drama that seemed to orbit around the rest of the Reynolds family like a bad smell you just can't wash off. He had no kids of his own, no wife, just a 2-bedroom house that always smelled like coffee and wood polish, a workshop filled with tools that looked older than me, and a gentle way of seeing through all the noise that made him the only adult I ever really trusted. While Chloe rolled her eyes every time she had to go to one of his 4th of July cookouts or birthday lunches, I looked forward to them like someone starving might look forward to bread. Not because they were flashy or exciting, but because they were quiet and unreal. When Ray got sick, it was me who took him to appointments, sat with him during chemo, and cleaned his kitchen when he was too weak to stand. Chloe came once, brought some store-bought muffins, stayed 20 minutes, and left early because her youngest had ballet. She sent flowers later, I think. Ray never said anything about it, not directly, but I remember the look he gave me when I sat beside his hospital bed, feeding him soup and pretending like everything was going to be fine, even though we both knew it wouldn't be. It was a look that said, "I see you, I know what you're doing, and I won't forget." A few weeks before he passed, he handed me a brown envelope, unsealed, thick with documents and a handwritten letter on the same lined yellow paper he used for grocery lists. I didn't open it right away. I didn't need to. I could tell by the weight of it, by the solemn way he pressed it into my hand, that it wasn't a gift. It was a responsibility. And when he died, I finally read it. In his neat, slanted handwriting, he'd written, "You've always been the quiet one, Emily, but I know what that quiet hides. You've got strength, not loud strength like your sister, but the kind that matters. I want the house to go to you, not because you need it, but because you've earned it." And just like that, with a signature and a stamp, the ownership of our family home, yes, the one I still lived in, was transferred into my name, not from my parents, but from my uncle. See, what no one knew, not even Chloe with her expensive shoes and loud opinions, was that my parents had quietly sold the house to Ray 10 years earlier when they hit a rough patch financially. They never told anyone. They kept living in it, rent-free, under the agreement that they'd pay him back when they could, but they never did. And when the time came, Ray decided it wasn't them who deserved to own it again. For almost 2 years, I said nothing. I paid the taxes, I kept the kitchen running, I helped my father with his medication after his minor stroke, which, let's be honest, was not as minor as everyone wanted to believe. I cooked dinners, paid for repairs, and quietly took on bills that no one even noticed disappearing from the fridge. My mother knew, she had to know, because she asked me once, late at night, whether I was sure I wanted to keep it secret. She was scared of what Chloe would say, of what it would do to the already paper-thin illusion of family harmony. I told her I didn't care about Chloe's feelings. I cared about Dad's health. I cared about keeping the house functional, safe, standing. That was the agreement. But Thanksgiving shattered that unspoken contract. When Chloe laughed at me in front of everyone, when she mocked my life like it was a punchline to a joke she'd told 100 times before, something in me snapped. Not loud, not dramatic, but final. She hadn't earned the right to belittle me. She hadn't earned the right to call me pathetic in the home I kept afloat. She hadn't even seen what I'd given up to be there every day, to make sure the people who raised us weren't drowning in debt or silence or sickness. And most of all, she didn't know the truth, because I'd never trusted her with it. When I laid that folder on the table and said what I said, I wasn't looking for applause. I wasn't trying to humiliate her, though God knows it was satisfying. I just wanted her to understand that silence isn't weakness, that staying doesn't mean failing, and that sometimes the people you think are doing the least are carrying the heaviest load without a sound. She stared at the deed like it was written in a language she'd never learned. Her face, always so composed, so smooth and controlled, twitched at the corners. Tom leaned over to glance at the paperwork, and the expression that flickered across his face was something between awe and confusion. Mom didn't move. Dad blinked slowly, then whispered. He told me, before he died, said she'd do right by it. That was all he said, but it was enough. I left the folder open on the table, stood up, and began to clear the dishes. Not because I was retreating, not because I was giving her the satisfaction of thinking I'd said my piece and was finished, but because I knew that moment wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning. And Chloe had no idea how much more she didn't know. There's something deeply unsettling about watching someone who's built their entire life around control begin to lose it, especially when that person has spent decades convincing the world, and maybe even themselves, that they are the stable one, the admirable one, the one everyone should aspire to be. That night, as Chloe sat at the table staring at the folder like it was a trap she hadn't seen coming, the finely tuned image she'd spent years projecting began to erode in front of all of us, and though part of me wanted to feel bad, to reach across the table and offer her some sort of comfort, the truth was that I didn't. I didn't feel bad. I felt relief. Her silence stretched longer than I expected, and it wasn't the stunned kind, not entirely. It was calculating, desperate, the kind of silence someone keeps while they're rapidly trying to rewrite the narrative in their head before the room realizes that the emperor has no clothes. Then she laughed. Not a real laugh. Not a full-bellied or even sarcastic one, but the sharp, forced sound of a woman trying to assert dominance she no longer had a claim to. "You forged something," she said quickly, her voice brittle but rising. "This is insane. Uncle Ray wouldn't do that. He would never cut Mom and Dad out like that." I didn't respond because the weight of her denial was already collapsing under its own ridiculousness. She knew Uncle Ray. She knew he was methodical, generous in his own quiet way, and deeply, almost stubbornly principled. The idea that I had somehow manipulated him into signing over a property he didn't want me to have was so far removed from anything true that I didn't even have to refute it. She was unraveling, and everyone could see it. Tom shifted beside her and asked in a voice that was trying a little too hard to sound casual, "Wait, so you're saying your parents sold the house to Ray, and you now own it?" He looked between us, obviously struggling to piece together what this meant for his precious Thanksgiving dinner and the equilibrium of his marriage. "When were you going to tell anyone?" Chloe whipped her head toward him like he'd just betrayed her, and for a split second, there it was. The raw, unpolished version of her, the one not curated for social media or holiday reunions. "Don't take her side, Tom," she snapped, the veneer cracking more with every syllable. "She's just doing this for attention. She's always been jealous of me." That finally got a reaction from me. Not a laugh, not a smirk, but the smallest shake of my head, slow and deliberate. "Jealous," I said, and this time I didn't bother keeping my voice neutral. "Chloe, I've cleaned Dad's bedpans. I've stayed up nights when Mom was too anxious to sleep. I've worked full-time jobs while also managing this house, managing them. You think I'm jealous because you have granite countertops and a mortgage in the suburbs?" "You chose that," she yelled, standing up so fast her chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "You chose to stay. Don't pretend like you're some kind of martyr. And you chose to leave, I said flatly. You chose to visit once a year. You chose to keep pretending everything was perfect so you wouldn't have to deal with anything that wasn't. So don't act like I failed while you soared, because the only difference is that I stayed behind and picked up the mess you didn't want to touch. Mom finally spoke then, her voice softer than I expected, but laced with something bitter. That's enough, both of you, she said. But she was looking only at Chloe. Her eyes were tired, defeated, and not once did she glance at the folder still open on the table. She's not lying, Chloe. Ray told us after he signed the papers. He told me he was giving the house to Emily. He said she was the only one who gave a damn. Chloe blinked, as if she'd just been slapped. You knew? She said to Mom, her voice barely above a whisper. You let me come here every holiday. You let me believe. We didn't think it mattered, Mom interrupted, though her tone suggested she now knew just how much it did. We thought you'd be happy not to have to worry about any of this. You always said you hated this place. Chloe sat down slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her wine glass and missed. Tom caught it, but neither of them said a word for a few long seconds. The kids, who had been half distracted by their phones and tablets, looked up in that eerie, instinctual way kids do when something has shifted in a room too drastically to ignore. The air was different now, denser, more fragile. Then Chloe turned to me again, and this time her voice was hoarse. You don't deserve this house, she said, not shouting now, but speaking with a certainty that could only come from belief or delusion. You've never built anything. You've never had a real job, a real relationship, a real life. You just exist. I stepped forward then, not to intimidate her, but because I wanted her to really hear me, to see that I was done playing the role she had always assigned to me. Neither did you, I said, and for the first time that night, I let the venom slip through, just a trace. You built a version of your life that fits on Facebook. You married a man who barely looks at you and had kids because it made you feel complete, but you abandoned your family when they needed you. You mocked the only person who stuck around. So if we're going to talk about who deserves what, maybe you ought to start by looking in a mirror. She didn't reply. She couldn't. Because deep down, beneath all that armor of performative perfection, I think she knew I was right. And still, I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. When I walked away from the table that night, the room behind me still vibrating with the sharp sting of my last words, I didn't storm off or slam any doors, because the truth is, I didn't need theatrics to make my point land. I knew it had already lodged itself deep, like a splinter no one would be able to ignore, no matter how hard they tried to pretend it wasn't there. I moved slowly, deliberately, carrying the half-cleared dishes with me, as if this were just another ordinary night, just another Thanksgiving where I played the quiet helper in the background while everyone else performed their parts like a well-rehearsed sitcom cast. But this wasn't ordinary, and we all knew it. Something had broken open. And once something's broken, you can't unbreak it. You can only see what spills out. The kitchen was still warm, the smell of turkey and sweet potatoes hanging in the air like a heavy memory. I put the dishes down and leaned against the sink, gripping the edge with both hands, trying to calm the sudden shaking that had started in my arms. Not from fear, no, that had burned away long ago, but from the adrenaline that always comes after you finally say what's been trapped in your throat for years. There's a strange emptiness that comes after a confrontation like that, like stepping into a room you've always avoided and realizing it's not haunted after all. It's just been waiting for you to turn on the light. I heard the sound of soft footsteps behind me, the slow, uneven rhythm of someone who walks with a cane and a little too much pride. I didn't have to turn around to know it was my father. He cleared his throat gently, and I could feel his presence settle beside me in the way a tree might cast shade, not intrusive, but impossible to ignore. You know, he said after a long pause, his voice raspy and weathered, the way old vinyl records sound when the needle hits a worn groove. I always wondered if Ray was going to do something like that. I turned toward him, surprised not by his words, but by the quiet clarity with which he said them. He wasn't angry, he wasn't disappointed, he was simply acknowledging. He told me, Dad added, tapping his fingers against the handle of his cane. Didn't give me details, just said, Emily's the only one who sees the house for what it is. I didn't ask what he meant. I figured I didn't need to. I wanted to ask him why he never said anything, why he never told Chloe to shut her mouth all those times she rolled her eyes at me like I was a grown child playing house instead of an adult holding things together with duct tape and determination. But I didn't. I didn't need to. The answer was in his eyes, tired, apologetic, but no longer blind. Maybe he'd always seen more than I gave him credit for. Maybe he'd just never had the words. You did right by us, he said, looking down at the floor like the sentence was heavier than he expected. By your mother, by me. I should have told you that a long time ago. I nodded, swallowing hard against the sudden tightness in my chest. This wasn't a grand emotional reconciliation. There were no violins swelling in the background. But it was honest. And in our family, honest was a currency more rare than gold. We stood there for a while in silence, the kind that didn't feel awkward or unfinished, just necessary. Then I said, She still doesn't get it, does she? He shook his head slowly. No, I don't think she ever will. Chloe sees the world through a lens that doesn't include sacrifice unless it comes with applause. And there it was. The truth, simple and unadorned. Chloe had spent her life being praised for things that looked good from the outside, but required none of the messy, invisible work that actually held a family together. She got credit for showing up, while I stayed in the background doing everything no one else wanted to think about. And the thing is, I never asked for recognition. I never wanted a medal. I just wanted someone, anyone, to notice, to understand. Back in the dining room, the noise had quieted. No one was laughing anymore. The kids had been sent to the den to watch a movie, and Chloe sat stiffly in her chair, arms crossed, eyes red but dry. She looked smaller now, not physically, but in the way people do when the scaffolding of their ego starts to collapse, and they realize they don't know how to stand without it. Tom, for all his usual detachment, kept sneaking glances at me, hesitant, like he wasn't sure if he should apologize or ask for answers. As Dad and I walked back in, Chloe glanced up, and for a fleeting second, I saw something flicker in her expression. Not regret, not guilt, but confusion, as if she still didn't understand what had happened or why the ground beneath her had shifted. And maybe she never would. Maybe the gap between who we are and who we believe we are is just too wide for some people to cross. Tom stood up and walked over to me, lowering his voice as he asked, Why didn't you ever say anything? About the house? About everything? I looked at him, and for once he didn't seem smug or superior, just genuinely curious, so I told him the truth. Because it wasn't about proving anything. It was about keeping the people I care about safe, even when they didn't see it, even when they didn't deserve it. He nodded slowly, digesting that, and for a second I thought he might say something more, maybe offer some half-hearted apology on behalf of his wife, but instead he just stepped aside, giving me the floor, as if he knew the next move was mine to make. And that's when it hit me. Not all at once, but gradually, like the slow realization that the storm has passed and you're still standing. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't hurt. What I felt was something purer, something harder to define. Power, maybe. Not the kind that screams or demands attention, but the kind that comes from knowing, truly knowing, who you are and what you've done, regardless of whether anyone else claps for you. I looked around that table, at the people I had once loved unconditionally, and realized that maybe unconditional love wasn't about letting yourself be stepped on. It was about knowing when to step away. And as I sat down, picking up my cold plate like it was the most natural thing in the world, I knew one thing for certain. Chloe thought the worst had already happened, but she still didn't know about the letter in my drawer. The one Uncle Ray had left me that I hadn't opened. Not yet. There's a strange stillness that follows emotional destruction, a quiet so unnatural it makes the air itself feel heavier, as if the walls are absorbing the tension because the people in the room have run out of places to put it. That's exactly what it felt like after I sat back down at the head of the table, surrounded by half-eaten food, broken eye contact, and the remnants of a holiday that had derailed so thoroughly it could no longer even pretend to be anything close to celebratory. And yet, in that silence, I wasn't uneasy. In fact, for the first time in what felt like years, I was calm, not passive, not numb, but calm in the way someone is when they've said everything that needed to be said and watched the truth settle into the floorboards like dust from a shattered mirror. The truth, as it often does, had changed everything. And while Chloe sat across from me trying to collect the shards of her image, and my mother kept glancing at her plate like it might offer her some script to explain her silence, I knew this wasn't the end of something. It was the start of an honest reckoning. A new order in a family that had for far too long lived on a foundation of performance, politeness, and the ever-present pretense that keeping the peace was more important than living in the truth. I took a sip of my now lukewarm wine, slowly, deliberately, letting the pause linger in the air until it became unbearable. Then I cleared my throat, leaned forward slightly, and with a quietness that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could, I began speaking, not for defense, not for pity, but because I had one final piece to lay down, and I wanted them all to hear it clearly. I never wanted the house, I said, my eyes fixed on no one in particular, but letting the words travel across the table and hit where they may. When Uncle Ray gave it to me, I didn't celebrate. I didn't even know what to do with it. I almost gave it back. But then I thought about Dad, about how much care he was going to need after the stroke, and I thought about Mom, about how much of her life she'd spent running this house and how quickly it would fall apart without her routines. And I thought about all the ways Chloe had already checked out, how she sent texts instead of calls, how she sent birthday cards signed by her kids but never made the effort to show up. And I knew if I didn't take responsibility, no one else would. No one interrupted, and that silence gave me the strength to continue, to open the last door they'd never dared to look behind. I didn't just take over the deed, I continued. I took over the bills. I paid off what was left on the mortgage with my savings. I paid the property taxes when Mom forgot. I paid to have the downstairs bathroom redone when Dad couldn't make it up the stairs anymore. And I did all of it without asking for help. Not because I didn't need it, but because I knew I wouldn't get it. I knew I'd get judgment, sarcasm, maybe some patronizing suggestion to hire a nurse or put him in a home. But I also knew none of you would actually show up, so I stopped asking. My mother opened her mouth, maybe to protest, maybe to offer some half measure of gratitude, but I raised my hand gently, and she went silent again, which was in itself a miracle. This house isn't just walls and a roof to me. It's the place where Dad taught me to ride a bike in the driveway, the place where Uncle Ray sat in the backyard, telling me stories about Vietnam and fixing radios like they were magic, the place where I cleaned up spills and blood and vomit and grief while Chloe visited for holidays and took photos for her Christmas cards. So if you want to stand there and talk about who deserves it, maybe start by asking yourself how much you've actually given to it. Because I didn't take this house from you. I protected it from being lost. Chloe looked like she wanted to disappear. Her mouth was tight, her eyes wet, but she didn't say a word. Tom sat beside her, strangely quiet, his hands folded in his lap, like he wasn't sure whether to comfort her or slowly inch away. My mother had her arms crossed tightly, a defense mechanism so rehearsed it looked like it belonged on a coat rack. But Dad, my father, who had rarely taken sides, rarely spoken his truth aloud, nodded slowly, deliberately, and said only one word. Finally. And somehow, that one word cracked something open in Chloe, because her face twisted into something between shame and fury, and she blurted, "So what now? Are you kicking them out? Is that your big moment? Finally get to play queen of the castle?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms, not to close myself off, but to remind myself that I was in control now. not just of the conversation, but of the narrative. No, I said calmly, I'm not kicking anyone out, but from this point on, we do things differently. No more lies. No more pretending everything's fine while I carry the load in silence. If you want to be part of this family, you don't get to just show up when it's convenient and pass judgment. You show up with help, or you don't show up at all. Chloe looked like she wanted to argue, but Tom gently put a hand on her arm, and for once, she didn't shake it off. Maybe he'd finally seen enough. Maybe for the first time, he saw the version of her that the rest of us had been tolerating for years. We finished the meal in relative silence, each bite somehow heavier, now that the performance had ended. Afterward, while everyone pretended to clean up just to avoid eye contact, I slipped away upstairs to my room. Not because I was hiding, but because I needed to see it with new eyes. This place I'd called home and battlefield and prison and sanctuary, all at once. I sat down at my desk and opened the top drawer. The letter from Uncle Ray was still there, just where I'd left it all those months ago, still sealed, the envelope slightly yellowed at the edges, the weight of it somehow more palpable now that everything had changed. I hesitated, part of me afraid of what it might contain. Another burden, a final request, or worse, something that would reopen the wounds I'd just started to close. But curiosity won. I tore the seal carefully and unfolded the single sheet inside. His handwriting was familiar, steady, and yet slightly shakier than usual, like he'd written it from his hospital bed. Emily, it read, I know you're probably furious with me for doing things this way, but I've watched you for years, and I know what you're made of. This house was never just bricks to me. It was the last piece of our family that still had a chance to mean something. I know you'll take care of it. I also know it'll come at a price. I just hope that one day you'll realize what I always knew, that you weren't the weak one. You were the strong one. The kind of strong that doesn't need to be loud. I read the letter twice, then again, and when I finally folded it and placed it back in the drawer, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger, not bitterness, not even triumph. Peace. And yet, as I stared at the quiet room around me, I knew deep down that this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of everyone else finally seeing it from the right side.